So let's talk about the G word. Firstly, this whole idea is terribly confused. We're not actually mostly talking about the G word, God, when we're talking about the G word. So that most of the people who want to talk about the G word are talking about something else, yet demand that they're not. And most of the people who want to declare in a kind of absolute way that the G word is nonsensical or just made up are also talking about something else. So let's see if we can tease some of these threads apart and make some sense of them for a moment. There's a couple of questions involved here, and if we identify the questions first, it will help. The first question is this: could the universe itself be some kind of intelligence or meta-intelligence? Could it be more than intelligence? And since the universe turns out to be the origin of intelligence, like ours, this question is important and meaningful, because if we say, no, the universe is not like intelligence, then it's pretty peculiar that intelligences like ours just appear down here. And if we say, no, the universe is not like intelligence or more than intelligence, then we're kind of saying that the origin of intelligence is not intelligent. Yeah? So that's one of the questions. Is the universe itself intelligent or more than intelligence? And that's a very reasonable question for everyone, regardless of what you may think or believe. It's just as important a question for scientists as it would be for religious people or people who are unconcerned with whether there's a God or not, because they themselves have an intelligence with which they're curious or thinking, we hope, about this question. So then the second question that's important is, this is kind of a weird one, did an intelligence create this universe or this world on purpose, like something it made, as we might imagine the way we make things, intentionally? Okay, that's a much trickier question. And then we have the question that's even far stranger, that goes like this: are particular stories in particular books either true or the truth about these questions? Now, that third thing is essentially impossible. Now, that doesn't mean that it has no truth value or no relationship to these questions, and it doesn't mean it has no true relationship with them. It means that the way that most human beings relate with these text artifacts is symptomatic of damage rather than understanding. So what we have are a lot of people objecting not necessarily to the idea that the universe is either intelligent itself, for example, time-space is like a kind of intelligence or meta-intelligence. Hopefully not too many people would necessarily feel forced to object to that, but they definitely object to the incredibly silly sounding ideas and often the incredibly strange actions of people who, shall we say, believe the book stories of God, the people who have skybooks. Now, this tradition of skybooks goes way back. The difference is that it used to be the actual living sky rather than things written in books. When it was actually the living sky, there was still a lot of confusion late in the game. Early on, I think our people understood and lived with and as the sky book in relation with the earth, and there weren't a lot of there were no stories like the ones we have, even though there may have been the ancient predecessors of what we call stories. So, if we separate the questions, is the universe, is time-space itself intelligent? Was there a creator who intentionally created the universe or this world, or mankind specifically? I'm not sure we would have this kind of question if we didn't have these strange books and all of the people who are relatively hypnotized, not so much by the books, but by specific interpretations of the books and weird frameworks that have arisen around these interpretations. So it's even weirder than just that the people are fascinated by the books. What happens is something fairly bizarre. A vast, complex array of representational frameworks arise around the books and basically just breed over human social time. So the whole thing is very confused. It's confused to the degree that some people seem to think that the often poorly understood idea of evolution explicitly either denies the possibility of a divine intelligence, or refutes it, or scientifically that since the idea that the universe is intelligent is not necessary for our understandings of evolution, we needn't consider it and may as well dismiss it. There's no evidence of it. That's kind of a peculiar position for a simple reason. If we just imagine time-space as a kind of water, like in a cup, right? Then we can see that the features of time-space, molecular chemistries, radiation, electromagnetic radiation and such, gravity, all of the forces we're aware of, they move all these dusts around, and then these dusts kind of condense, and they condense into stars and worlds, and one of the things they obviously condense into is living minds, like ours. Now, it's possible to say that that whole process just turns out to be an incredible, unlikely accident, but it doesn't seem very likely that living worlds produce, shall we say, billions of organic expressions of something that's unlike their origin. In other words, unlike time-space. Yeah? It seems more likely by far, and rather obvious and intuitive, that stars are an expression of the nature of time-space. Yeah? No one has any problem understanding that. No one has any problem understanding that black holes are an obvious expression of the nature of time-space. It doesn't require religion. It doesn't particularly require science. We know those objects are there. They're obviously an expression of the context in which they are in. Huh? So it seems pretty obvious that organisms and living minds, and perhaps something, we may have to discover what we really mean by this, but souls are absolutely an expression of time-space, right? Not a bizarre one-off accident, inexplicable somehow, whoops, that just fell together that way. That does not seem very intuitively like anything that's familiar to us, except perhaps a specific theory, theory with great authority. And of course, the theory of evolution, there's, like, as I understand it, somewhat naively, there are two theories, but one of them is not a theory, it's just simply a fact, right? It's simply a fact that organisms evolve This has nothing to do with believing anything. It's demonstrable just by observation and testing. So anyone who wants to say evolution isn't true is saying something like approximately, H2O isn't true. It's not actually H2O, it's water. Doesn't have any real molecular construct. A guy who wrote this book we have made it, or something like this. So obviously that doesn't work. When we keep the questions separate, it's pretty difficult not to think that everything around us, time, space, all of the gaps between organisms, time itself, it's pretty hard to think it's not exactly intelligent, but more than intelligence. The origin from which intelligence is continuously derived and transformed and developed. Intelligence, like all of the different intelligences of Earth, rather than being intelligent, being representationally intelligent like our species is, the other organisms of Earth simply are intelligence. That's why they don't talk to you, at least not in language. In fact, were they to be representational, they wouldn't be able to be the kinds of organisms they are, and our minds would never have developed. Since our minds are in some way, how should we put it, an expression of the incredible diversity of biorelational intelligence in which they emerged. Our minds were, the minds of our species were like a candle that was lit by the incredible diversity of the intelligence in which our ancestors were immersed. Unfortunately, for machines and stories about God and such, we're burning all of that down, thinking that we've already received the gift. Now that we have it, it doesn't matter if the origin stays alive or what happens to it or who gets to own it or what. Unfortunately, that's exactly the opposite of the truth. Our species doesn't possess anything at all. Our intelligence is always an expression of the health and biodiversity of the contexts in which we are immersed, which we are born, in which we develop. So anything we do there immediately affects every human mind on Earth. The relationship is not one of connection, it's one of unity. Our minds are in unity with the biorelational envelope that they are an immediate expression of. Interestingly, that starts to look something like what we imagine a God to be. In other words, the consistently intimate field of biorelation on Earth, one position up from individuals and mankind's way of thinking about it, pretty obviously comprises something not like a brain or mind, but like a superposition over identity, like a form of dreaming that is consistently the source of minds and bodies on that world. Something not unlike a God. If we were to then imagine that living worlds are connected, and though we scientifically suppose this to be impossible, our species is very young in terms of its understanding of science, and we imagine we know much more than we've yet come to be able to see. Science itself is still extremely young. So if the worlds were merely to be connected, then we would see phenomenon here, be able to access them directly, with which we might pursue such conjectures, to put it mildly. in my own experience, I find something like this to be true, but there's kind of a simpler way to understand an aspect of what I want to get at, which is just that in our own bodies, we're comprised of something like 400 trillion cells. 90% of them are bacteria, they're not human. Yet we have minds. In fact, we're having, this experience right now of communicating about these organisms, which we can't necessarily see at all, except with special equipment. So, is it these organisms communicating? If it isn't, that's rather strange. What is it? Right? And if it is these organisms, I'm one organism, we think of me as distinct, especially in language, then it's really bizarre that there's something that looks almost like a god to my body, right? That is to my body something like what our common imaginations of God, would be to humans. So it's kind of intuitive that there's something like this. And it's not reasonable to just dismiss it, even though it's quite reasonable to dismiss stories about it and descriptions and things. It's similarly reasonable to dismiss many stories and descriptions of the sun. For kind of simple reason, if there weren't the sun, there wouldn't be any stories or descriptions. So why would one imagine that the origin of minds locally, from which stories and descriptions emerge, could be contained in a story or description? Or worse yet, more startlingly, that, for example, the sun would write a book. Wouldn't that be strange? That would be so strange that it would be as if you went to a bookstore and you found a book written by language. Why would you see how incredibly unlikely that is? So it isn't, of course, that those who've had experiences of what we associate with the divine might not write books, of course. But to have anyone saying something very, very threatening and actually dangerous, that this book was written by God, that kind of thing essentially it sets up something like a viral bomb for human intelligence. That idea by itself is so incredibly dangerous that anyone who knew anything about human minds and language and representation would go in completely the opposite direction from that, unless they were trying to make a weapon. And that's precisely what these books primarily do and are for in our cultures, regardless of the claims. On the other side, I should mention that my own experience with these books is very deep and rich and profound. They're among the most dangerous artifacts in text ever produced by mankind, with the possible exception of, various kinds of weapons plans and things like this. But it is not that they are not without value, nor is it that they have no relationship to the subjects that they portend. They do, but the relationship is much more delicate and peculiar than any of us are likely to commonly imagine, especially in any kind of organized religious sense, or so it is in my experience. So it's not very, we should keep the questions separate, right? Is time-space intelligent? Is there a reason to believe it can't be? Okay, so that's one question. Because if it is, then there's something probably even more interesting than our ideas about God going on. And then, is there a creator? Is there a God that created the world? Now, that's a weirder question. We can explore that. I don't have a great interest in that idea. And yet, I have some in it. Again, the idea is not entirely without merit, but the way we ordinarily pursue it is pretty dangerous. And I think starts out from a very, very confused position. And then, what about books about God? That's a much more dangerous question that we have to be very cautious and sophisticated about. But we can essentially say, without too much trouble at all, that most of the organized religions are doing approximately the opposite of anything that any prophet worth trusting would be very interested in. There are exceptions. And also, I think the idea that some given prophet is the prophet is also very dangerous. For as we know, wise men and women and children occur in every culture on earth throughout all of time. If we were to imagine that there's simply one, or the one, again, I think we're going to damage the basis of what it means to think or have human intelligence. No one says, for example, Einstein was the prophet, right? That would be rather silly. Yet in his domain, Einstein, supported and aided by many other brilliant minds, certainly was a prophet. Let us notice that the results of his activity were not as, how shall we put it, beneficent or beautiful as we might have hoped, because the cultures in which they landed had very dangerous purposes for such ideas. So, I hope you've enjoyed exploring this question a bit with me. Perhaps it's cleared up a few things. I guess the one thing I'll mention before I go is that I think most of the people who identify as atheists are actually really against the ideas promulgated by people who equate the existence of God with particularly ridiculous interpretations of stories in books. That is a very worthy objection, but it should not be confused with the refutation of the possibility that A, the universe is intelligent, somewhat like our own bodies, everything we see in nature. And they may also have some concern that I think is reasonable about the idea that a creator intentionally created Earth. And then finally, we've heard lots of weird stories lately about actually, most of these stories are just gross misrepresentations in the press. There are very, very few people who believe or would say that the universe is anything like a hologram. Let us presume that those people are confused, because holograms are things that humans make. They are artifacts. And the origin, it's like saying the sun is a hologram. I mean, just, it's kind of ridiculous. What is sometimes referred to as a principle that is hologram-like, but much different from holograms in all of nature and in physics. Now, what's interesting here is that the experience that ordinary humans have that's most like a self-generating hologram is dreaming. So if someone were to say to me, do you think the universe is a hologram being projected by, I don't know, a mechanical process, for example? Or do you think the universe is the result of some kind of non-ordinary dreaming phenomenon? The dreaming phenomenon is the much more obvious explanation. Notice that we didn't arrive on a planet covered with machines. And when we, look in the sky or even out in space, we don't find any machines, right? There's none of them here. So it's just not very likely that reality is like machines. Your brain is nothing like a machine. It doesn't do computation. That's something that happens in adding machines or, mathematical calculations. To say that we are like machines is to change the meaning of biology in a way that is dangerously confused. I don't think the universe is anything like, quote, a hologram, or certainly not a computer simulation. But it does appear to share many important qualities with something that is not merely dreaming, but the origin of this mode of being. Yeah? And this is far more interesting and provocative, far more accessible and intuitively like our own experience than anything coming from machines or science. The most astonishing thing to discover is that all of the authorities who are proclaiming wild new futures and impossible realities and afterlives and communicating with the dead and psychism and the New Age and all of this, quantum mechanics. It's not that science is uninteresting. Science is certainly fascinating and worth paying attention to. A lot of the public sort of confused celebration of misapprehensions of science, I think is sort of tragic and comedic at the same time. But what is more interesting is this, that our own minds and bodies are direct expressions of these phenomenon that are timeless, that are beyond the entire range of human concepts, don't even fit inside the categories we've been given, and are directly accessible to us, especially if we will just for a moment set down most of what we have learned and most of what tells us what to expect or look for, and actually encounter the unimaginable novelty of our position and nature as human beings. It is far more interesting and exciting than all of religion, all of the things we've heard from, gurus and paradigms, and all of the drug experience, and all of these things. Far richer, far deeper, far more ancient, more astonishing, and far more strange. So let's together get a taste of whatever's really going on, and then once we're engaged in that process, we won't be so busy arguing about books and authorities and declarations and opinions. Won't that be a relief?